I wouldn't have got so angry, right? So they try to blame the child, and that keeps the child from telling his secret. They threaten a loss of affection. If you tell someone this happened, it's going to just destroy our family, and nothing's going to be the same ever again. Sometimes there's outright threats. If you tell someone, you'll just get worse. And then there's other factors that conceal it. Sometimes the child is simply embarrassed about what has happened, and sometimes the child, whether the abuser or not, has tried to place blame, takes blame. Sometimes they simply take it themselves and take the responsibility. Why do we tell you that? Again, because we want you to be looking for the signs of abuse and not saying, oh, it couldn't happen here, it couldn't happen there. And second of all, we want you to understand that when we come down to our section on reporting, if a child tells you, someone's hurting me, they've had all that working against them, and they've taken a huge step of courage to trust you with that. So you really need to understand how hard it is for a child to say that out loud to you, okay? So that's why we lay all this out here. That's unfortunately the world we live in. It's a dangerous world. I'm happy to say that we have only had to use this policy once in 5 years. It was a bullying case, and the families were able to resolve it without our having to use our policy. So these things haven't happened among us, but it's the way the world is, and we need to be aware of it, and we need to be wise to the ways of the world. Wise to the ways of the world, so we move on to our second item, which says that St. Stephen has enacted policies that try to control the 3 greatest risk factors for abuse happening in our programs. The first risk factor is the amount of isolation, okay? So here I am with all of you. We're not isolated at all. This is a public setting. But if I take 2 or 3 of you downstairs, our isolation has increased. It's a smaller group. We're farther away from everybody. If I take 1 of you into the bathroom, the isolation is tremendous. And the risk is tremendous. The risk that a child might be abused in that situation, or that I might be accused of abuse in that situation with no one to tell the difference, all right? Because it's just my word versus a child's word. And I got to tell you, in today's day and age, people are going to believe the child before they believe the adult. So if a child makes an allegation against you, that could really lead to trouble for you. So we want to make sure that we are never isolated with children. Second risk factor is the less accountability there is in the system you're working in, the more danger you're in. So accountability is, for instance, this training. We say to all of you, you have to know how we do some things before you can help with kids. That's accountability. We're holding you responsible for your actions. We're going to fill out some paperwork on you, and we're going to know who you are. That's accountability. We know where you live, right? We can track you down. So that's accountability, that we have some policies in place that say this is how we're going to behave, and we're going to hold our people to it. Third, the imbalance between power and control, as that increases, then there's more risk. So for instance, again, pick on Gregory since he's sitting right here. If Gregory's watching a 6th grader, and you're going to be what, 12th grader this year? You're senior year? Junior, okay. He's a junior in high school. Well, you know, that's bad, right? If he's leaning on a 6th grader, that's a bad thing, because he's a tall guy and he's getting his shoulders and all that nonsense, right? Now, if Mrs. Shaw does it, it's a little bit worse, because not only is she, you know, bigger, but she's also an adult. So she has sort of an aura of authority about her, because we're trained to listen to adults. So if she starts leaning on that 6th grader, now there's even more problems. If I start leaning on that 6th grader, it's even worse, because I'm the pastor. So not only am I big and an adult, but I also have a title that gives me authority within the program. And I can abuse that authority if I'm not careful. So you have to recognize that the more power you have over a child, the more at risk the child and you are. In order to control those things, St. Stephen has put these 8 policies in place. And you notice on the chart how each of them includes the accountability, right? Because we want everybody to follow these things so that we're held accountable. And then they try to adjust for isolation and for an imbalance of power and control. As we go through these, this is probably the most important one of our policies. This is the most basic of our policies. The most basic of our policies is the 2-worker open view rule, which basically says never be alone with a child in a closed room. That's sort of the gist of it. It says anyone working with children will be accompanied by another worker, so there's another set of eyes in the room, or will provide visual access to the room during any ministry activities. So the basic rule of thumb is don't be alone with a child. That's the basic rule of thumb. It raises too many red flags of danger. We always want to have at least 2 people in the room other than the child, or we want to have open visual access. So, for instance, our school building, although it's over 50 years old, is actually very well designed for this kind of thing because the majority of the rooms all have large windows in them. So even if you're just walking down the hall, you have an expectation anybody can look in at any time. Okay? So there's that expectation there. A good policy is if you are alone with a child, make sure the door is always open. Never close the door on the room if you can possibly help it if you're alone with a child, because you want to have not just visual contact, but audio contact as well, that people can hear what's going on in here. Okay? So be careful for isolation. From an adult point of view, this probably affects you, Mrs. Shaw, and me more than anybody else here. Individual counseling sessions can only happen with the prior written permission of a parent or guardian, and even then, only in a public area or place with visual access. So if you ever have a youth who wants to really talk to you, you got to do it in a public place. And you can't have a closed-door session with this child apart from the mom and dad's say-so. It might restrict it if they want, it might be a problem if they want to talk about mom and dad, but we have to protect our program. So, if you send little kids to the bathroom, it's preferable to send them in pairs, okay? That's the kind of thing that you'll be doing. Don't walk a 4-year-old if you can possibly help it into the bathroom, right? Unless there's another 4-year-old or a whole group of them with you. Just reduce the amount of isolation you have. Secondly, growing out of that, we have a transportation rule, which basically says don't take kids who aren't your own if you can possibly help it. We want those who are coordinating our programs to have prior written permission before they transport a child who's not their own, okay? This does not cover, for instance, carpooling, right? If your child's in a sport activity over at the school and you make arrangements to have Cal come with us, that's between parents, right? But if I'm the coach and I say, will you transport children, then I have to arrange to have permission slips that you're able to do that, okay? When we have carpooling for field trips, we assume that carpools are under the supervision of a teacher, so the restrictions are lightened a little bit there in terms of carpooling. But even with carpooling, we do want to make sure that we never send a child alone with an adult who's not their parent. Okay? Always make sure there's someone else in the car with them. The transportation rule. The overnight rule basically is, again, a spelling out of the 2-worker open view rule. The overnight rule has a couple of stipulations. First of all, overnight activities need to have written permission on file, that we have a written permission slip that says, yes, my child can come overnight. Second of all, we have an appropriate staffing clause, which is basically don't violate the 2-worker rule. So if you have boys and girls at the activity, you need to have at least 2 volunteers who are men and 2 volunteers who are women. That might be like a lot of overkill, but that's the way it has to be in order to make sure that in the boys' dorm there's 2 men, in the girls' dorm there's 2 women. Okay? And thirdly, we assume that every overnight activity is a closed activity. We do not release children out into the night because they say, I want to leave. If mom or dad is there, or mom or dad has given a note that says they're leaving at 11:30 with their Aunt Sally, that's one thing, but we don't simply say, I'm going to walk home now. Our answer is no, you're not, because we are responsible for you. Okay? That's the overnight rule. You see how these are all related very closely to the 2-worker rule. Nursery identification rule basically says we're not going to give a child into the care of someone we don't recognize. So if we are using the church nursery, that child is released only into the care of the parent or legal guardian or a person who has been designated in writing in advance. Unauthorized persons will not be allowed to remove infants and children from the nursery. Occasionally, again, you have to have a little godly common sense here, right? And, when our kids were little, Joshua was 6 and Abby was 2, and we could occasionally send him down the hall and say, go get your sister out of the nursery. But everybody knew that Joshua was, her brother. So, a little common sense there. But should an adult come in and say,